Welcome everyone to today's webinar on the EU's foreign subsidies proposal and its impact on the European economy. My name is Christian BORGGREEN, and I'm heading up the European office of the Computer and Communications Industry Association. Our membership includes a range of European and international technology companies. In a moment, we'll hear from a top-notch list of speakers from the European Commission, from the European Parliament Rapporteur, and from a leading economist and a leading legal expert who will each share their analysis of the proposal and its wider impact on the European economy. I believe you should be able to ask questions through the chat function, so I encourage all the attendees to ask questions throughout the session, or if you prefer, after the first round of opening remarks from the speakers. This event is on the record, so you're very welcome to tweet and to quote the speakers. All right, let's get started. So in May last year, as you know, the Commission presented its proposal for a regulation on foreign subsidies distorting the internal market. The proposal addresses subsidies granted by non-EU governments to companies engaged in economic activities in the EU deemed to distort the EU single market. The context, or at least one of the contexts of the proposal, is this rise in subsidies that we have seen by governments. We've seen it in Europe, we've seen it globally. Obviously, sometimes when we think of subsidies, we think of sort of dubious aid given to, say, state-owned enterprises. But the truth is that governments frequently provide subsidies, for instance, to address societal challenges, to the fight against climate change, or to promote economic recovery, as we're currently seeing in Europe. So subsidies can be good, but it can also be bad, as it will be discussing in a moment. The Commission argues that the subsidies granted in the EU isn't per se a problem, as it is already covered by existing EU rules, such as EU state aid rules, merger controls, antitrust, or public procurement rules. However, the EU laws only apply to EU states and to EU established companies, hence the need for this new regulation. With its proposal, the Commission suggests to grant itself broad powers to investigate and to address potential distortive effects of foreign subsidies. The proposal specifically foresees 3 new investigative tools: an ex officio general investigation of foreign subsidies, an ex ante notification for mergers and acquisitions, and an ex ante notification for public procurement activities. Compliance obligations on companies are arguably quite extensive, and penalties can go up to 10% of a company's turnover. The overall initial reaction to the proposal were generally positive. There have been some, however, in industry, in European Parliament and Council, where a few have warned that the obligations shouldn't make it too difficult for foreign companies to invest in Europe. And as CCA, we agree that while the proposal seeks to address valid concerns, we do fear that it inadvertently could have the consequence of hindering international investment that Europe so desperately needs to kickstart its economic recovery. This wasn't the Commission's intention, and hopefully lawmakers will improve the proposal to make it more workable for both European and international businesses. Our first speaker is Alexandre Bettuti, who is a case handler in DG Competition, so for the European Commission, but today speaking in his personal capacity. Alexandre, after my little bit colorful introduction to the proposal, maybe you can just kind of take a little bit step back and just remind us of the bigger rationale for the proposal and for the obligations that are laid out in the proposal. Alexandre, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you to the CCIA for having me alongside such distinguished speakers. I'm honored. And maybe just to reiterate again that, of course, I am speaking today in my personal capacity and not representing necessarily the views of DG Competition or the European Commission. And with that, I think you already summarized it quite well in a way. A few years back, we started looking at what started to be flagged around as an issue, and indeed we identified a legal gap. And I think that it's relatively consensual that there is a regulatory gap. We have state aid in Europe for subsidies granted by member states, but we don't have control of foreign subsidies, even when they affect the internal market. And so In a way, we set out to fill that legal gap to restore the level playing field in the internal market. And we set out to do so in an effective and efficient way and in full compliance with our international obligations. I think that is a key point. What does this mean in practice? In practice, the proposal strikes, in our view, the right balance between the need to target those foreign subsidies that are most distortive for the internal market and the need to ensure a streamlined process that will continue to attract foreign investment to the EU. It builds on familiar pre-existing concepts, and I think that's a key point, ensuring a level playing field and predictable regulatory environment for businesses. And in particular, notifications of large concentrations will in most cases come on top of other prior notifications, which are already required today. And they have aligned timelines, thereby leading to no delays compared to today's situation. I think that's really the very broad picture, if you allow me. And I think I will stop the introduction there because I'm sure also the attendees are quite familiar with the proposal. Maybe let the other panelists speak, and I think we can then have an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandre. Maybe just one quick follow-up question here, and then we'll go to the next speaker, BENOԻT. Has there been any assessment, and I realize this is quite difficult, but has there been any sort of assessment on how the proposal might impact the EU economy, how might foreign investors think about when they look at this and whether they want to invest in Europe? Can you say anything about that point?
Sure, I'm happy to have a quick response, and maybe we can discuss more with BENOԻT thereafter. I think we have an impact assessment which accompanies the proposal for regulation, and there we try to look at that. Now, let's be fair that also not so much information was directly available. I think that's one also of the issues with the subsidies generally and foreign subsidies in particular. And so what we have in the impact assessment is a few things. One is that the legal gap is there. And so it's something that needs to be filled. There seems to be a problem, and we want to address it. So that's a bit the rationale. Now, in terms of quantifying the impact, we looked at the proxies that we could see. One proxy was the entry into force of the FDI screening regulation and FDI screening mechanisms nationally. And there it seems that although in very short term it may have an impact on foreign investment, that quickly recovered, and ultimately there doesn't seem to have been a negative impact there. I know that maybe BENOԻT will say maybe that's not the best proxy or a full comparison. We acknowledge that, but I think we believe that's the closest we could find. And more generally, I think a few points to mention is that, of course, our proposal is fully compliant with WTO law. That means that it's non-discriminatory. It's not about foreign investment. It's not about foreign anything other than foreign subsidies. So it applies to all businesses active in the internal market, both foreign and European. So it's not about foreign investment. And it's also not about investment in the sense that it's about all activity in the EU. So as long as you're already present, active in the EU, which will typically be the case of many businesses, this applies to you. So it shouldn't be really a disincentive to invest further since it applies to you already. And whether you would, walk away from the internal market because of this instrument is, in our view, to be shown. And maybe just a final point is also that of course this applies to subsidies which distort the internal market. And so while it could be a deterrent to subsidized activities which distort the internal market, we don't see that it would be a deterrent to legitimate investment which does not benefit from distorted foreign subsidies. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you so much. So we heard tricky to calculate sort of the economic impact, but and also that this is not about foreign investments, and it shouldn't provide, at least in theory, a disincentive for foreign companies to invest in Europe. BENOԻT Durand, you're a partner at RBB Economics here in Brussels. We asked you to have a look together with your team of economists to analyze the Commission's proposal. Would you mind sort of sharing sort of the highlights of your findings, please?
Yes, thank you, Christian, and thank you for inviting me, and very happy to discuss this topic with Alexandre and Nicole as well. I mean, by way of introduction, so, you know, as an economist, when we look at policy proposal, we like to look at it from, you know, the cost-benefit analysis. And I think, you know, the Commission has indeed provided an impact assessment which tried to do that. And we had a look at that, and, you know, we come out a little differently than the Commission. Now I like to explain how we do that. But it's also fair to say that we only focus on FDI, so on foreign investment largely. So there are, as Alexandre is right to point out, that there are also other aspects, but our focus is on FDI only. And on this point, we come out a little differently because we, in a sense, we highlight, we think, some issue with the current proposal as it's formed. Although we understand the logic, the idea of leveling the playing field, that sounds, it's hard to disagree with the objective itself, but I think where we may have issues is how it's going to be implemented, and the fact that it's raising some cost that may not, or would be interesting to know Alexandre's view, but whether these costs have been really properly taken into account, and whether they actually these costs outweigh the potential benefit, which also not necessarily always clear cut. So let me dig a little bit further into why we think there might be some issue. And why we think specifically the proposal as it stands would probably affect foreign investor willingness to pursue business venture in the single market, and how, as a result of that, if we have less FDI, we may have an impact, a negative impact on innovation, growth, and jobs in the EU. So why is that? Well, first, because the proposal as it stands increase or create new risk, and particularly specifically legal uncertainty for multinational who are looking to complete acquisition or participate in government procurement procedures, or the prospect also of pretty burdensome investigation is also there, is looming. So how do you see this? Well, the thing is, why do we have legal uncertainty here, or why is the proposal creating legal uncertainty? Is because at the moment, the proposal is pretty vague on what is a foreign subsidies and when it is distortive. Okay, essentially, what you may have is the Commission will treat financial contribution received, for example, for goods or services supplied to foreign public entities, as involving a foreign subsidy. So a company that is doing business, quote unquote, with a foreign government could be viewed as receiving a foreign subsidies. And therefore, this could trigger an investigation, and an investigation that could lead to redressive measures. So that is clearly a risk. Also, and the Commission acknowledged this, it's not because you receive a foreign contribution or foreign subsidy that it will distort competition. The Commission will have to make a case-by-case assessment and determine whether actually the subsidy is distortive, i.e. the cost-benefit analysis comes out on the wrong side. So again, that leads to a fair amount of uncertainty as to where it's going to come out, you know. And I think it's important to differentiate this regime from the state aid regime that applies to basically subsidies of European government contribution to the economy, is that at least for state aid, this legal uncertainty does not arise because basically the regime is such that firms know whether the subsidies they receive from a EU government is going to be state aid or not very quickly, immediately, and then they can decide on doing their investment or acquisition and so on. That is not the case for foreign investors. So that makes, I think, in our view, a difference. Now, I don't have necessarily a solution for this, Alexandre, but I'm just telling you that is a risk that's there. You know, sorry, I'm only an economist, not a legal scholar. The other thing, and adding to this, is obviously, and as it would be expected, you have a redressive measure, a strong redressive measure. So it's not just the burden of the investigation; it's also the fact that, you know, if the subsidy were found to be distortive of competition, then there is the risk of far-reaching measures, even going to divestment compulsory licensing, so on and so forth. So it's not exactly small thing for company. So we believe that at the moment, this type of proposal is likely to discourage some foreign investor to come in. And as a result of that, either people will wait to see how the game is going to be played, so to speak, whether the Commission will clarify the rules, and so this may lead to a delay in investment, or people may just, at least for some time, go elsewhere and decide to invest in other countries. So there is certainly a risk that this is going to lead to a reduction in FDI, certainly in the short run, as you acknowledge yourself, but maybe for a longer period than you might think. So I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to go quickly. You do look, and you already alluded to it in the impact assessment, you do look at whether or not, in the past, screening mechanism have led to reduction in FDI. I think it's fair to say that, your assessment is pretty simplistic. You look at basically previous screening mechanisms that are not necessarily representative of the proposal, and then it's just a very quick and dirty, so to speak, excuse me for the expression, look at it. But there are other factors at play that have not been controlled for. So if we wanted to do this properly, we would have to do this more sophisticated manner. And there are studies out there that shows more sophisticated studies, not based on this particular proposal, but that shows that when you start playing, or at least tweaking rules on FDI, you do lead in a negative manner, you do lead to reduction in foreign investment. So I think we should not underplay that. Now, very quickly, why that is bad? I mean, people expect that less investment would lead to a negative repercussion for the economy. And actually, there are many studies that shows that. So I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this. But essentially, we know that FDI is good for the economy, triggers technology spillover, assists human capital formation, help create a more competitive business environment, and enhance enterprise development, so on and so forth. So this is well recognized. I don't want to dwell too long on this. There is also important aspect on innovation. 25% of R&D development, research and development investment in the EU is made by foreign company. So that's important to keep in mind. This is also good for job and wages. Again, refer to our paper on this if you are interested. There's many reference, many studies. So there are quite a few potential costs to this proposal that I think have been somewhat underplayed, or at least understated. And then what about the positive impact on competition? Because in theory, this proposal should develop some benefit for competition, by restoring the level playing field. Well, it's not always clear-cut to us that's the case. And let me just take the case of subsidized acquisition, for example. The Commission acknowledged that if there is a subsidies or subsidized acquisition, then the seller of the company will actually benefit financially. If the price paid for the company will be increased as a result of the subsidies, there'll be an inflationary effect on the acquisition price. So actually, I would argue that, if anything, that could increase entrepreneurship in Europe, because that will raise the rate of return on investment of those person who actually have this entrepreneurial spirit and wants or will sell the company later. The concern the Commission has actually is that the subsidy will crowd out more efficient acquirer. Those would be outbid. It's not very clear where this concern comes from and how this is going to distort competition. And if this concern exists, which there is no evidence of, how this is going to be outweighing the potential seller benefit. So just raising out there that I understand the level playing field, but when we start talking about the benefit to competition, they are not obvious either. I had many other things to say, but I will conclude on one last point, is that it seems to us that, Chinese state subsidy may have been the main motivation and target for the EC proposal to level the playing field. And it's this recognized, and I put it in your document, that indeed China probably account for most of complain about subsidies in the WTO. However, what we see is that the proposal does not discriminate between country, between firm, between anything. So it's just a wide net that's going to catch many foreign investors. And we do wonder whether it is the right tool, given that actually, if we are concerned, for example, about, and I'm thinking about foreign investment here, if I'm thinking about foreign investment from China, we could be subsidized or heavily subsidized. They represent a very small proportion of FDI stock in the US, in the EU. So I think we need to consider whether, yes, there is a great objective on paper, leveling the playing field, but is it at the moment worth tackling? There you go. I'll stop here. I'm sure there'll be many reactions to this.
Thank you. I think there's probably no. I think there's a consensus that it is worth tackling, right? But I think the question is just how to do it, right? Maybe just one sort of silly question here, but it sounds like this is a problem for foreign companies. I mean, if they want to do business in Europe, well, then there's just going to be a lot of compliance and red tape, and they, just deal with it. I mean, what is the problem for European companies? What is the problem for Europe? Benoît, if you unmute, please.
Mute is always the problem, right? So for foreign, I mean, the thing is also, yes, sorry, Christian, the proposal also is will have repercussion on European companies as well as on a couple levels. First, European companies do business, or in quote, with foreign government. They do. They receive subsidies actually from the US government on many counts. Would that actually have an effect on them? Will they start being investigated because they receive a US subsidy for research and development, for example? What about the auto manufacturer who receive a lot of those subsidies to go and establish plant in some state in the US? Would they be also, I'm talking Mercedes, I think, or BMW receive some of this subsidy. Would they be subject to this type of investigation? This is going to be interesting. The other point I would like to say is that could there be also a retaliation measure if we go ahead with this proposal? Would the US, the UK, who is outside the EU now, which are the two major trading partners of the EU and actually are basically the country where most of the FDI come from, would they start establishing rules that mimic or maybe even go beyond to protect or at least put at jeopardy EU investment in the country? So I think this also is something that needs to be thought about, because we know, for example, in international trade, it's quite common to have tit for tat. When you start raising barriers, then the other country reacts by doing exactly the same thing or sometimes worse. So I think people are quite aware of this type of strategy. So we need also to be concerned that it might not necessarily be good for European companies who are trying to invest abroad and expand or find new market and or acquire new technology. That may also have a negative impact for EU companies. So I think this is also something that needs to be taken into account. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Benoît. That's a perfect bridge to the next two speakers who will go a little bit more into detail with this international dimension with the EU's trading partners. Might they be inspired, or might they be a little bit sort of lukewarm on this approach? Thank you very much, Benoît. We'll get back to you in a moment here. And please, everyone, there's a chat function. I think it's under your upper left in case you have any questions to any of the speakers. So the next speaker is Christoph Hansen, and he is a member of the European Parliament, and he's also the rapporteur on this proposal here. Due to the recent European Parliament midterm reshuffle of portfolio, Mr. Hansen has been, I think he's been given a major promotion, it sounds like, has taken up a number of new responsibilities, including becoming a questor on top of his various co- and rapporteurships on various files, including this one here. So congratulations to Mr. Hansen. He has been very kind. So he couldn't take part live, but he has very kindly sent us this message, which is outlining his report and his work on this file here. Here we go.
Dear participants of this webinar on IFS, dear Mr. BORGGREEN, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation to this webinar. Unfortunately, to the reshuffle we had in the midterms in the European Parliament, I had to readjust my agenda as the incoming new tasks take a lot of my time. So at the moment being, I have to coordinate my responsibilities as a rapporteur for the instrument on foreign subsidies, as a rapporteur, shadow rapporteur on the European green bonds, and as a rapporteur for the deforestation regulation, and of course my new task as quaestor and as member of the Bureau of the European Parliament. Nonetheless, I'm recording and sending you this message on the foreign subsidies proposal, as this proposal is and will be one of the most important instruments for our trade policy. After having seen the proposal by the European Commission, I can happily say that I support the overall aim and design of the proposal. It addresses the long-standing regulatory gap that puts European companies at a competitive disadvantage vis-à-vis certain foreign competitors that have benefited from foreign subsidies. Whereas subsidies given by EU member states are subject to rigorous scrutiny under EU state aid rules, subsidies given by third countries often escape such scrutiny. This leads to a distortion of the level playing field in the internal market and can lead to European companies being crowded out, stifling innovation and job creation within the Union. Hence, I fully share the sense of urgency when it comes to closing this legal loophole. It enhances the EU's open strategic autonomy to level the playing field between European and foreign competitors in the internal market. Moreover, the necessity to enforce the rules of the internal market is a necessary precondition to shore up continued support for open and fair trade policies, which remain the main source of prosperity inside the EU. As such, this proposal plays a crucial role in the wider endeavour to strengthen the EU's open strategic autonomy, to undergird its outward-looking posture, and to address growing trade scepticism among our citizens. I also welcome the instrument's potential to give impetus to the plurilateral and multilateral development of rules to address distortive foreign subsidies, which is a dimension of the proposal I have actively sought to strengthen. In my view, thanks to the inclusive process leading up to this proposal, including the publication of a white paper and extensive public consultation and impact assessment, the Commission has tabled a proposal with a high degree of maturity already. For the changes I propose, the overall efficacy of the instrument has been my guiding compass. Given that this regulation will undeniably entail administrative burden for all parties involved, we need nevertheless to avoid that it becomes bogged down to procedures and turns into a paper tiger that we definitely want to avoid. So this is also why I welcome the fact that the European Commission is the sole enforcer of the regulation to allow for a homogeneous application in the EU single market. We have to be careful, however, that without adequate resources for implementation, this instrument could rapidly lead to excessive administrative burden for the Commission, augment red tape and for foreign and European companies, and ultimately hamper as well investment in the internal market without actually moving the needle on counteracting distortive foreign subsidies. This is why I have decided to maintain the thresholds for the notification-based instrument. Nevertheless, high thresholds need to be paired with a greater clarity on the activation of the ex officio instrument. That's why I have facilitated the access of stakeholders and member states to approach the Commission with information potentially leading to the start of an investigation. I have also introduced the possibility for the Commission to propose revising certain thresholds in the light of experience derived from the application of the regulation. Instead of via delegated acts, I have folded this into an anticipated review clause of 3 years, because in my view, this concerns an essential element of the regulation and thus merits a greater involvement of this European Parliament. Special attention should be paid to introducing possibly lower sector-specific thresholds in emerging industries of strategic value if the data collected by the virtue of this instrument shows that foreign subsidies more often distort acquisitions in these specific sectors. To further strengthen the regulation, I have also proposed that the abuse of dominant position in a foreign company's home market, for example, where such company benefits from a monopoly or a preferential access, this position would allow them to generate excessive profits, which in turn unduly strengthen the company's competitive position in this home market, could also be considered as a financial contribution and thus potentially represent as well a subsidy that can fall under the scope of this regulation. One of my larger intervention has been to make known future subsidies notifiable under this instrument. I suggested a change following as well the discussion with many stakeholders to close a potential loophole where subsidies that are committed and decided by a third country government but not yet disbursed or otherwise effective would enable a foreign competitor to submit abnormally low tenders or make abnormally high bids for acquisitions. All this while evading scrutiny under this regulation. So this was an important loophole that we had to fill, with a view to reducing to a minimum the administrative burden that this new instrument will inevitably impose on European as well as on foreign companies and on the Commission as sole enforcer. I have clarified that where a third country is found to operate a subsidy control mechanism that is equivalent to the Union's both in law and in practice, foreign subsidies provided by such countries may be considered as unlikely to be distortive, and this will allow the Commission to better prioritize its work. And I was inspired by, in doing so, by the possibility of the Commission to adopt unilateral decisions on equivalence in the area of data production and financial services. We know it. The Commission can put this equivalence out, can withdraw it at any moment. So I think this is quite waterproof as well. And finally, a major point of focus for me as trade coordinator has been to reinforce the international dimension. This regulation is conceived as an autonomous instrument in the absence of progress within the multilateral fora such as the WTO, where the problem of distortive subsidies for services and investment would ideally be solved. As such, I see this regulation as the opportunity for the EU to double down on its commitment to advance multilateral and plurilateral solutions to distortive subsidies. Therefore, I have introduced the possibility for the European Commission to engage on behalf of the European Union in third country dialogue where persistent and systemic distortive subsidy schemes are run by a third country or are discovered. And these schemes should also be addressed at the appropriate multilateral fora in the hope that this will give the impetus to the development of multilateral solutions. And in this context of our outreach and standing by our international commitments, that one should understand the suggestion for the regulation to be replaced and repealed, should it ever be made redundant by a fully fledged multilateral rules based mechanism that are guaranteed and as effective as the present instrument. And dear all, I would like to apologize once again that I could not attend the meeting physically today, but I wish you a very interesting discussion, and I will be as well at your disposal for future exchange of views or direct questions you have on the instrument. And until then, I wish you a very good and healthy afternoon, and hope to see you soon in person.
Very good. Very interesting input there from the rapporteur. Obviously, I took note of a few things here. One is the belief that this will be one of the most important instruments for the EU's trade policy. Obviously, rapporteur very much in favor of the proposal and eager to finalize it, like the French wants to do, also during their French presidency. there is this recognition that it undeniably will entail administrative burdens for all parties involved. He's thinking very much of the Commission, of course, but of course also for the companies. I think he talked about more red tape also for foreign and European companies that could ultimately hamper investments in the EU internal market, with the risk of not moving the needle on actually countering this sort of foreign subsidies. Interesting suggestion on the idea of introducing this equivalent mechanism, right? So if a third country, let's say if United States kind of copied the EU's subsidies proposal, well, then subsidies granted presumably in the US would probably not be considered distortive. We've seen this. I mean, we're a tech association. We've seen, it was mentioned, the reference to data flows. We've seen similar excellent ideas, and in practice, they work quite differently. I mean, just in data flows, the Commission's decisions to grant equivalence to the US twice have been struck down in court. So there's a lot of uncertainty for companies involved. But it's not to dismiss the idea, but just to say that in practice, it has not been that easy for companies doing business internationally. And then finally, the point that this is an opportunity for the EU to double down on its commitments to advance multilateral and plurilateral solutions for distortive subsidies. And there's this idea he's introducing to repeal the proposal should there be a global agreement. This is the sort of the perfect bridge to our last, but certainly not least, our final speaker, Nicole Carr, who is partner at the law firm Linklaters. A lot of things here to pick up on, and I kind of want to just hear your sort of broad assessment on which could complement BENOIT's economic assessment. But tell me here, has the Commission found the silver bullet to the stated problems? And if not, what are sort of the risks that you are seeing?
Thank you very much, Christian. And I'm really pleased to have been invited to speak to you on the subsidy proposals. I think it's a fascinating area. I mean, maybe if I can answer your question, but after I give a few opening remarks. The first is that although I'm concerned about the implications, as Benoît is, of these measures for Europe and for investors into Europe, I do have to admire the ambition of the measures. I mean, it's very unusual, I think, to be at the birth of a new policy and legal instrument. And in my lifetime, we've seen quite some, I think, in response to, the fifth industrial revolution and the rise of challenges brought by a digital economy. So, in some ways, I'm kind of very struck by the breadth of the ambition that the Commission and the European Parliament has demonstrated. We've talked a little bit about the genesis of the proposal. And I mean, I think it's been in trade circles for many, many years an issue, the scale of the subsidies that have been given by some governments to domestic industries, which via complex supply chains do have implications globally. And I think, it's very interesting to think about some of the work that's been done, for example, by the OECD, and maybe of direct relevance to the CCIA members. In 2019, the OECD wrote a paper which measured distortions in the semiconductor value chain. And that paper concluded that using conservative assumptions, total government support had exceeded US $50 billion in a 4-year period, the previous 4-year period. So extraordinary scale of money being pumped into by governments, certain industries. And this was below equity kind of support in many cases. I mean, I think it's striking, just as Benoît was saying though, yes, huge support being poured in by China, between 5 and 15 billion worth of support into their semiconductor sector, but huge sums being poured into the semiconductor companies by the US government. So quite hard to be targeted, I think, and be selective in how you think about this issue and thinking it's just a Chinese issue. I mean, certainly as Alexandre says, European regulators have been increasingly conscious of this regulatory gap, whereby, I mean, in trade circles, you talk about transnational foreign subsidies. But, the idea of subsidies that support companies that are active outside of their domestic market aren't captured by state aid, foreign investment, merger control, antitrust rules, or WTO or trade defense instruments. So, I think there is this regulatory lacuna. And what we have is a little bit of a, if you don't mind the term of Frankenstein, marriage of competition principles with trade principles in a kind of hybrid response in the form of the draft regulation. I think it was very colourfully put by Vice President Vestager when she said in June 2020, if you ran a club and you wanted to make sure there was no trouble, you could check people on the door before they came in, but you could also have checks inside the club to make sure that everyone follows the rules once they're in. And then that's clearly the idea is within the European internal market, let's think about where the money is coming from and how it's being used. But that's a simple problem to say and a difficult problem to solve, I think. You know, it's a long-running, very significant global problem, novel solution to it, but I think one that has some very significant practical implications. And Benoît touched on some of these. I mean, I think there are really two categories. The first is that the measures will certainly have potentially quite wide-ranging implications for auction processes of European companies. And they effectively add an additional process to an EU merger review, which can be lengthy and has become lengthier over time. They will certainly handicap some bidders and, I mean, I think somewhat ironically, create an unlevel playing field that is tilted particularly toward financial sponsors, not state-backed financial sponsors, so private equity companies with private capital, and European companies. And I think the three proposed instruments, the subsidy investigation tool, the notification obligation for M&A and public tender obligations, just as Christoph said, will certainly increase the administrative burden for companies that do business in the EU. And that's because they're complementary rather than replacing any of the existing instruments, but they create some duplication, overlap, and potentially conflict. Because in foreign and European companies benefiting from foreign subsidies, those foreign companies, potentially the European target, will have to be able to diligence where the source of the funds comes from, which is easier said than done. They will have to put in separate notifications under the EU merger regulation, national FDI rules, and the foreign subsidies M&A instrument. The notifications will address different aspects of different transactions. Under the new proposal of regulation, that at least will have one authority in the form of the European Commission. So the earlier proposal considered the possibility that member states might also enforce alongside the Commission. That's now been centralised, but could certainly lead to different outcomes and remedy requirements, just as Benoît was saying. And I think this point that Christoph was making about international trade instruments and international reciprocity was the way I think Christoph was thinking about it. I mean, there's certainly wider and longer term impacts for European companies globally because, you know, as we know through the COVID crisis, but more generally, EU companies have very significantly benefited from various member states' authorised state aid measures. And there is therefore a not hypothetical concern that they could become targets of third country measures aimed at disciplining the effects of EU's foreign subsidy rules in third party markets. And the EU trading partners, as we talked about, you know, very significantly the US and the UK, could go further than simple retaliation against the EU to compensate for their eventual losses in trade and services and investments. So raising tariffs or creating barriers to services, trade and investments. They could do copycat regulation, even copycat regulation that targets specifically European countries. There would be WTO issues with that, but it's a possibility. And I think ultimately you could see a regulatory race to the bottom with spillover effects worldwide. So I'm unfortunately not as perhaps optimistic as Christoph that the EU will lead the way by example and we'll see replica export of international state aid law, if you like, from Europe to the rest of the world. And Europe has been incredibly successful in exporting many of its regulations to the rest of the world. But I'm not sure in this particular context that model works. And I think what I would prefer, if I had a clean sheet of paper, was very targeted, proportionate subsidy controls in particular sectors. So Christoph mentioned the idea that we might learn by doing, and I think that could have quite some damaging effects. It would be better now to identify those sectors, and they're well known in trade circles, that benefit from huge foreign subsidies and target those sectors specifically. Sorry, my dog is barking in the background. I apologize.
Very quick question, Nicole. Thank you so much. Super helpful. Quick question. Alexandre said earlier that this regulation is compatible with the WTO obligation, the WTO system. Can you just give us a little bit more context there?
Yeah, so I think, just as Alexandre said, there is, I think, clearly at least two deficiencies in the WTO subsidy controls countervailing measures agreement. The first is that it is largely thought, I mean, some academics disagree, but it's largely thought to really only deal with distortive subsidies that are given by a country in country, so it's domestic producers, and isn't focused on transnational distortions. So I think that's at least one problem. The other problem, as the Commission's pointed out a number of times, is that it really relates to goods only and not services. In terms of compatibility, I mean, a little bit of that depends on how the Commission enforces, actually, because there is an Article 32 in the SCM agreement that has its own enforcement mechanism. And there are some, services aren't always neatly definable as services as opposed to a goods element. So I think the Commission will be alive to not infringing WTO rules in the way that it enforces. But using European anti-subsidy regulation will very much need to be tailored to the particular measure in case, the particular subsidy in case. And I'm assuming there'll be a kind of filter within the Commission to make sure that it doesn't infringe the WTO in that respect. But I think it can be compatible, yes, with the WTO system. I'm a little bit more dubious that it leads to a faster trilateral arrangement or multilateral arrangement at the WTO level. I mean, there are various issues at the WTO level, as we all know, with the administration of it and the kind of, effectiveness of the organization.
Thank you very much. I have one final question, then afterwards I'll let Alexandre respond, since I'm sure he has a lot of comebacks to some of the things that have been raised here. But Nicole, you said, I think I read somewhere, you talked about this risking backfiring on European companies, and you talked briefly about it. Can you just give a little bit more context? And I asked Benoît, I realized I asked Benoît the same thing, but I mean, it sounds mainly as an issue for foreign companies.
Yeah, well, I think the issue is really one. I think perhaps the impact on European companies has been slightly overlooked, because I think if we take the M&A instrument, for example, if I'm a European target and I'm in the process of being sold, I do really need to do some diligence about where the buyer's funds are coming from, because if I don't and there's redressive measures imposed, I might not have the acquisition finance, might not be there. I mean, I may not have a source of funds. I may not be able to continue employing my workforce. I mean, there are some pretty potentially big implications of that. And it is not easy, as we're finding in the foreign investment context, to do diligence on acquirers' structures, where their money comes from. I mean, it would be easy if everyone was defining it as, illicit money being put in by the Chinese government into domestic industries that are, investing abroad. But it's actually not that straightforward in most cases. There are some examples where it's that straightforward, but I would say the definition of financial contribution is so broad that, for example, a nice Australian pension fund or a nice Canadian pension fund that gets certain selective tax treatment in their home country, because they're looking after the money of pension holders in that country and invests abroad. I mean, the way I read it, that is a financial contribution. There's a question then whether there's a subsidy involved, but you can get a flavour through these practical examples that it's a really quite difficult exercise. And I think the onus ultimately will fall on European companies that are in the process of sale to work out where the money's coming from, because it has potentially very significant consequences for them. So that's just one example of the red tape. I mean, I think, if I'm running an auction process and I know a European company is being sold, the banks, the lawyers, the economists will be trying to analyse the risks that the buyers present. And we might end up chopping out quite a bit of that auction field because we decide we don't know, we can't diligence, or it's risky. And that has an direct impact on bid values. If I narrow the field, I'm actually suppressing bid prices, which impacts European shareholders and ultimately European consumers and employees. So I have a bit of the opposite worry to the Commission, which is not that someone's coming in with a bag full of cash to overpay for an asset. I have a worry that actually I'm eliminating people who I can't diligence properly, and that brings the bid value down.
it sort of goes to your quoting of Executive Vice President Vestager. Yes, you probably, if you have a club, you're probably going to have some sort of a gatekeeper before you get in, and maybe someone who checks you inside. But you can also do too much. I mean, there might be nobody coming to your party if the barrier is too high, right? A level of scrutiny. Thank you so much, Nicole. Alexandre, thanks for your patience. Finally, I will let you sort of respond to some of the points raised. I have a few questions if you're shy.
No, I'll try to cover I think a few points. I think there were many, so please forgive me if I miss a few. But I think these discussions are very interesting, and I want to reassure everyone also that within the commission, before we came out with the proposal, we of course thought of all these things. And maybe starting with the end, easier from my memory, with sort of the retaliation, etc. I think multilateral efforts are very important for the Commission, and I think it would rather be, especially for this particular problem, which is a global one, our preference to solve this multilaterally. But however, this is not the case currently. And we've been very attentive, as we've said, and I think has been recognized, to make our proposal compatible with international obligations, in particular WTO law. And the general logic is also just to be inspired by state aid rules and to sort of level the playing field. So from our perspective, this framework, this proposal, makes it very difficult to see this as something that is unfair and which would legitimize retaliation. And any retaliation, as Nicole said, would need to be in compliance with WTO law, so not target specifically European businesses. So that's a bit the way we see things. So we are a bit hopeful, maybe too optimistic, but hopeful, like Mr. Hansen, that this would not be an issue too much. When it comes to Benoît's points, which I think are numerous and I think helpful, I just maybe a few comments, if you allow me. On the positive effect on competition, I think there's several things to say. I think it's fair to say, Benoît maybe will forgive me for saying that also what is in the RBB study is not so specific. It is by nature a bit vague. You don't really know. And for on that, several comments. One, as I said, our tool is not about FDI. It's about activity in the internal market. So it's much broader. One, and we don't think that it would be a deterrent, and I'll try to say more, but on legitimate activity or investment. Now, I read in the study, and Benoît, forgive me, I read that, I paraphrase, but there would be a reasonable fear that the Commission would find a distortion even when there is none. That I cannot agree with. I think our decisions will be reviewed by the court. So by definition, any decision that stands will find a distortion where there is one, and where there is no distortion, there will be no distortion found. So I think, and therefore I don't think it will have a chilling effect on legitimate investment, because companies, I think, can be reassured that under our legal system, there will be no abuse, to say things short. Now, and also speaking still about FDI, I think from my perspective, a first order impact on FDI is the FDI screening mechanisms. I honestly think that also because our tool is not about FDI specifically, but all activity, it would be rather a second or third order impact on this investment. So again, and as I said, usually the businesses we're talking about, especially if we talk about the acquisitions, given how high the thresholds are, these businesses will typically be already active in the EU, so they will already have to do this due diligence. I think this we acknowledge, that they will have to do due diligence to know what foreign financial contributions they're receiving. Yes, that's the intention of the instrument. Businesses will have to do that. Yes. But because they'll have to do that in any event, it should not have any chilling effect on any additional investment, and we strongly doubt that it would lead them to leave the internal market. So that is a bit the idea. And on Benoît, you had a few points. So on the legal certainty of the additional cost, from our perspective, we need to look at the marginal cost, right, of doing business. Well, again, we try to be inspired by existing concepts. Nicole is kind enough in her blog to confirm that subsidy is a very well-known concept, a well-settled concept in WTO law. The distortion is a very known concept, in spite of no guidance in Article 101 of the treaty. It is a very known concept for competition lawyers. all of the concepts used in the notification tool for concentrations come from the merger regulation, most of them. Again, not much uncertainty there. So maybe there would be a need to sort of combine abilities for lawyers. Yes, that may be the case, but we don't think there is so much uncertainty. And in particular, also in terms of delay, we think that most concentrations which will be notified will need to be notified under the merger regulation anyway, and the timelines are more or less aligned. So I think that's a bit where we've tried to come from. And also the details of the notification are not settled yet. Of course, this is something we're working on. And our objective is definitely to try to keep the additional burden as really at a minimum. On a few other points, again, also the uncertainty, again, Benoît, I mean, on state aid, I'm not sure there's that much certainty. If you take the tax cases with Apple in Ireland, I'm not sure they saw this coming necessarily. So, there is uncertainty by nature. And in terms of the benefit for the acquirer, the seller, getting a better price, yes, we think if that's because of foreign subsidies, that may distort. And also then we go to the point on the positive point is, it's trickle-down economics. Again, we're not sure that there has been so much evidence that trickle-down economics really work. And this brings me also back to FDI. Again, the positive effect on employment, on innovation, etc., is a bit vague. Again, we would not target any investment. We would target subsidized investment, which is distortive. We think this is probably not the bulk of investment, and therefore also not the bulk of the positive effects that FDI has in the union. Because I don't want to be too long, Christian, I will stop there. And apologies if I missed any point, but I think the discussion is very, very interesting.
Thank you so much. I have a quick question here, and I'm sure Benoît might also have a point, but quick question for you, Alexandre. You talked a bit about sort of this uncertainty, and inherently there probably will always be uncertainty when you do something new, especially when you're sort of a trailblazer globally and trying to sort of go first with this proposal here. On the uncertainty and on the point of distortion, it is interesting. There is this idea of a balancing test, right, where the Commission can look into whether the subsidized activity actually has a positive impact that outweighs the distortion, and then the Commission can sort of decide not to impose redressive measures. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because it sounds like a good idea, but as I read the text, it's quite vague on how to go about it. Like, what would be the criteria that the Commission would use to determine the EU's interest here?
Yes, I mean, I have to say, another disclaimer, I come from an antitrust and merger background, and this is a notion which is used more in state aid control, where there is this balancing element. So I'm not so familiar with the details. So I acknowledge that it's a bit vague, but I understand that there is practice in state aid, and so some level of guidance. And also this, I think, goes back to Benoît's point that there may be positive effects of FDI generally, and maybe even of subsidized and partially distortive FDI. And so I think it is a legitimate concern, and we have provided for this balancing, but on a case-by-case basis, not on a very hypothetical basis. And I think, there's not much more I can say. This will have to be done really case-by-case, mindful of, the distortion, the broader implications, and also possibly the positive effects.
Fair enough. Thank you. Benoît, let's go to you. One point we haven't sort of talked about is that Alexandre seems like a super friendly guy, but everybody in Brussels know that you want to be a little bit careful with DG Comp, right? You don't sort of just go waltzing in and say, oh, here's the sort of the 10 years of my business records from everywhere around the world. I mean, a lot of people would be very uncomfortable walking into and then handing over all this required data about their business to DG Comp, fearing maybe this could be used against the company in a different context. Even if they have nothing to hide at all when it comes to foreign subsidies, they might be fearful that there might be something picked up that they hadn't even considered. So I just wanted to throw that in the mix, Benoît, but I'll also let you respond to Alexandre's comments.
Yeah, I think I'm first going to respond to Alexandre's comment and then turn to this, which might be more a legal question. But just to come back, I mean, I have to disagree with you, Alexandre, on the legal uncertainty. Yes, the world is uncertain for sure, you're right. We don't know what tomorrow will be made of. But I think on the notion of legal certainty and to be certain, okay, how can you be certain that a subsidized investment will be distorted? You seem to think that first, and that I'm glad you think so, that you would know for sure whether an investment is distortive of competition or is subsidies. But I think we never know for anything, because they are, your work is not scientific, my work is not scientific, and there is a false positive and false negative in life. And you will hope that my comment did not make you turn your video, but I think it's important that recognizing that it's quite difficult to anticipate whether actually a subsidy will turn out to be distortive of competition. And in fact, I would take state aid as an example. The Commission is aware, understands that yes, there are subsidies, it's a non-concept, distortion is a non-concept, but in practice, it's not that simple always to determine whether the subsidies will be distortive of competition. And this is the reason you have guidelines, block exemption, and all of that good stuff to raise actually legal certainty, to tell company or what to anticipate. So I think the legal certainty point, if I may, is important. And DG Comp, which is doing a great job, by the way, I should say, on guidelines, typically on explaining its policy, on raising legal certainty, here falls short, massively short. And perhaps because you don't have, the practice will tell, you need to learn, we need to find out. And so therefore, to take the point of going big scale at the beginning without really knowing what we're going to find, is it the right approach, or should you do more, as was proposed by Nicole, a targeted approach by looking at particular sectors that, yes, we think that's an issue, let's look at this, let's learn, because you're going to learn, we will learn too, by the way, and find out when actually those activities, subsidies, and investment in particular, because I'm more concerned about the investment, as you see, are turning into distortive of competition, and therefore will be bad for actually the European economy as a whole. I think you need to distinguish between ambition and then practicality. And I think you should not, I should not say you should not, you do as you think you need to do, but I think the point of legal and certainty is not small for a company doing business. I think for them, red tape, what the risk that they will find, the legal risk, regulatory risk, is something that company takes very seriously. So I think it is something that we as European, and I'm citing on your cap here, should not shoot ourselves in the foot by not deterring investment that would have been actually a good thing for the European economy. I would be I'd be concerned about this. And I also noted, although Christoph Hansen was very supportive of the proposal, he had a few thoughts. And I think of the three instruments, the ex officio instrument is certainly the one that raised the most concern about legal certainty. I appreciate the other two have thresholds that are quite high, so at least give some a bit more comfort for many. However, the ex officio is basically a catch-all tool that is really concerning, and you do wonder whether you want to turn this off first, or at least provide a lot more guidance on how you're going to do it. I'll leave it to you, but I think this is important. And I've noted he took the point too, so I think that's got to matter somehow. And then on your point, Christian, on the whether you turn data and this is going to lead to discovery of other things. It could, but I think there is more of a legal question here that I'm not sure whether the information you discover in one particular instance can lead to investigation in other instances. I'm not too familiar with that, but if there was such a risk, then I would be concerned indeed, but I'm not sure it is. So I'll let rather Alexandre respond to this question, because he should know this better than I do.
Fair enough. And you could argue that, say, another country, less democratic perhaps, that would copy this, they may have different procedures for sort of Chinese walls within their departments. And you raised. I don't think Alexandre is saying that this proposal is perfect. Don't touch it. Just vote it through as it is. It cannot be improved. Nobody's saying that. I think the rapporteur, he said quite clearly, recognized that this will augment red tape for foreign and European companies and ultimately hamper investments in the internal market. That there is this risk, maybe even likelihood, that at least he will be paying attention to in the improvements that the Parliament and the Council will, as always, will be making to a Commission proposal. There's only one question from the participants, and please send more. This one is for BENOԻT, so BENOԻT, you get the chance to speak a little bit more, and then we'll go back to Nicole and Alexandre. There's one question here about the thresholds for the amount of subsidies, and Lydia Detling says that they seem quite high. How are companies operating in EU expecting to be affected by the regulation? Any thoughts on that? It doesn't have to be from you, BENOԻT, necessarily.
I mean, I don't know that any analysis has been done in terms of even the impact assessment on how it might impact. But I think what I would say, particularly for the M&A element of the proposal, the difficulty, I think, with the thresholds, yes, they're high. They're double the 250 million euros that you see on the merger regulation. On the other hand, they suffer from all the same issues as the merger regulation does. So if you have two big European joint venturers or consortium members, target might be very small. It's anyone in the group of acquiring companies, so they could satisfy the thresholds. So I think the difficulty is on the 500 million, which is a big eye-catching number, actually the way the mechanic of, because it piggybacks and replicates the EU merger reg, the issues with that, so the target could satisfy it itself and the acquirer doesn't have particularly large turnover in Europe or even any, or the acquirers can satisfy itself and the target is extremely small. These things can happen. And then the actual level of subsidies over the previous 3 years, 50 million, is actually quite low over a 3-year period, in my humble opinion, but Alexandre and BENOԻT should comment. So, I'm not sure what a typical level of subsidy is given the billions we hear about poured into certain protected sectors. But all I would say is I think you can't maybe read that it will afflict relatively few as it's a high threshold. I think the permutations of bidders grouping up to buy an asset mean that big private equity groups, for example, could satisfy the thresholds actually very easily.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to react quickly. First of all, I think it's important to note that the threshold is about financial contributions, not about subsidies. It's a bit technical, but this means also that the assessment of whether this is a subsidy will be for the Commission, not a self-assessment by the companies. And I think that's an important point. It also makes it much easier for companies to identify exactly what they need to notify and whether they need to notify. And I think for us, in terms of also legal certainty, that's an important thing. So on this specific, maybe just starting with this specific point, I see Nicole's point. Maybe one thing to say is that Mr. Hansen has proposed a slight change there. On the joint venture to precisely remove this issue. So I think that might be a solution there. On the other points, it's true that it's difficult to know because precisely for the moment there's very little transparency on for financial contributions and subsidies. So it may not affect the number of notifications so much. However, we do think that the threshold for turnover itself is really quite high, in particular with the change by Mr. Hansen. So we do think that this should be about very few cases per year. And this brings me to the BENOIT's point, I think, on legal uncertainty for, in particular, the ex officio tool. And this we understand, as I think you acknowledge, that's a bit the situation that you have when you have a new legal instrument. When you have, when you had the general Article 101, well, there was no guidance in the beginning, and it's a very broad article, and then you had practice, and gradually you gained more guidance. And I think it's good to hear that you think we're reasonable people. I think we are, and I think we're also open to discussing with businesses. And I think that's an important point, right? Our door is always open for businesses to come and talk to us. And I think that is also probably helpful in a startup period. I think, of course, in time, like we do for all instruments, we would look to provide more guidance. Of course, that is natural, even aside from just the cases and the case law. Yeah, thanks.
Just one little thing on the not on the threshold, but on what the size of subsidies, because the proposal suggests that any amount below 5 million in any consecutive 3 years will not be or unlikely to be distortive. So there is that view, but that's not super high. Yeah?
No, that's indeed not super high, and that's not a sort of, it's an unlikely, but it doesn't exclude the.
Yeah, it doesn't exclude, but it's typical that you at least you provide some view that anything below 5 million over 3 years, probably you're not going to spend too much time on this.
Indeed, because it seems quite low.
Yeah, but just so we're clear, for many businesses, that's a very low threshold too.
Again, it's difficult to know, but it seems low, yes.
Yeah.
And that sort of answers the question here from Gilles Tourneau. You may have seen in the chat here. He talks about how Mr. Hansen, the rapporteur, and the Commission seems to an agreement that the Commission's threshold seems to be the adequate ones, but that several MEPs arguing to lower those thresholds. Some have opted for applying sector-specific thresholds right off the bat. Eager to hear your opinion on this. Also, whether the Commission has considered the idea of specific thresholds for strategic or otherwise affected sectors.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and it's true I didn't react to what Nicole was saying. I think because the ex officio instrument is a bit of a catch-all, that's true, I mean, there are some suspicions, yes, of some sectors which might be more affected than others, but I think at this stage, we have a new legal instrument. We don't know, we're not completely on top of the situation. I think we didn't want to exclude anything. It doesn't mean we'll be, going after 7,000 cases throughout the economy per year. We simply won't have the resources to do that. So of course we'll need to prioritize, and by nature we will focus on the more clear-cut cases with the largest distortions. I think that's a bit obvious. And now on the and that also responds a bit to the sort of sector-specific thresholds. I don't know that we would have had the data or the knowledge to do that, so it did not make sense from our perspective. When it comes to strategic sectors, I think it's important to keep in mind that this instrument is about competition, distortions of competition in the internal market. It's not about, security, public order. It's not an FDI screening mechanism. I think, again, going back to one of my initial points on Benoît's study, it's not about FDI screening. It's not about national security. It's not about public order. It's not about strategic autonomy. It's about distortions of the internal market. And so in that sense, from our perspective, nothing prevents us from looking at these sectors if we see that there is a distortion of the internal market because of foreign subsidies, but there is no specific reason for us to be looking at these strategic sectors more than others or in any particular way.
Thank you very much. Nicole, do you want to, you haven't had the chance to speak for a while, so any comments you want to make here?
I think it's been said really. I mean, my impression is that the legislation is inevitable. I think there's quite a lot of member state support for it. I guess the issue, as Benoît has said, is it would be unfortunate if it was an own goal in terms of European investment, and so the filters, the exceptions. The idea of equivalence is an interesting one. I think it's a little bit tenuous for some governments. The idea it can be withdrawn. We see this in financial services in the UK very acutely. Data flows, obviously, is the other example you gave. But I think all measures necessary to make it as targeted and proportionate as possible should be considered, because ultimately, if this handicapped European competitiveness, that would be a very unfortunate thing. Which is, I think, we're all agreeing with each other on that.
Sorry, we're coming towards the end of time here. So any final comments or reactions from anyone, or any final questions from the participants? I see, Benoît, you are unmuted. I don't know if you want to be ready for.
No, I understand. We all understand the objective, and although the concept of fairness is not an economic concept, so I view this from a cost-benefit analysis, and obviously offer a light. I appreciate that there are also the fairness perspective. But I think it's solely, it would be damaging to the European economy if actually we would this would create more cost, or will create more reduce investment and economic activity. Although the idea would be to level the playing field. I think you need to weigh these different objectives and keep this in mind, because it feels a little that we are in this a new paradigm where we're raising barriers to trade, we're raising barriers to investment, and ultimately it's not certain to me that as European we will benefit from doing this. And if we want to lead by example, I appreciate this sounds great, but maybe if we want this to be a multilateral solution, it might be or it might have been worth to establish this with our closest partners and agree on a at least US UK solution where we know that we have a lot of most of the trades and most of the investments are with these countries. So I think I would not I think ultimately you would probably instead of moving unilaterally, it might have been a good idea to also think about not necessarily an international solution, but at least involving our major partners in this venture. That was a political statement, more an economic one. Sorry.
Maybe just to react on that, I think we are of course talking to our partners. It's not something that is exclusive of the other. But at this stage, as we've said, I think multilateral or even bilateral efforts have not been progressing, and we see an issue we need to address. I think there's a new question in the chat, which I think is useful to address. I think this is exactly the case. To clarify, we are exactly trying to do that, to mirror as much as we can, because of course the situations are slightly different, the state aid rules, and the approach generally is the same. And although we don't use the term advantage, which is in the state aid time, we use the term benefit, it is more or less exactly the same notion. But benefit, if I understand my stated colleagues, is more the WTO term. But again, sort of the assessment would be very, very similar. So be reassured that a bit what I said, we're using the same approach. Even if the word is not exactly the same, the assessment would be largely similar.
Thank you for answering that. Nicole, any other points you haven't made, or Alexandre, any other points before we wrap up?
Not from me. Thank you for a very good discussion, and thank you for Alexandre being so generous in being beaten up by 3 people.
It was my pleasure, and I think the questions were fair. I think it's also very useful for the public and also in particular businesses to understand a bit what the idea is behind there.
No, thank you to everyone. I'm actually quite surprised how relatively little debate there has been about this proposal. There has been sort of in competition law circles, in trade law circles, but I'm surprised that it hasn't had a bigger discussion. Not because there's something inherently wrong with it. I think everybody can agree to the need to have some sort of an action. But as Mr. Hansen said, that this is one of the most important trade instruments that the Commission is putting forward for many, many years. And of course, that this impact that it will have economically and in trade terms, we don't know exactly what, because it's very difficult to calculate. But I'm surprised that it hasn't been a broader discussion, which is also the intention behind today's webinar. But thank you very much to our kind speakers. Thanks for taking the time. I think, as said, yes, everybody can agree. This is a problem. It's a growing problem with some subsidies can be distorted and unhelpful. The question is it EU first? Is it EU with the US and its main trading partners, or is it sort of a global level first? There needs to be action. Yes, there'll be impact on foreign direct investments. We don't know exactly what. There's a lot of ambition in the Council and in the European Parliament. I think that's great. There's a lot of interest there, and also an openness to sort of analyze the proposal and to an openness to amend, as we heard from the rapporteur, to ensure that the regulation actually works as intended and avoid any unintended consequences, which is not unlikely. You know, when you're a trailblazer, when you're first, there will probably be things you haven't considered because it hasn't been done before. So good to see there is that openness to discussion and to amendments to make sure it doesn't impact Europe's economy in a negative way and doesn't lead to any sort of retaliation with the EU's trading partners. So thank you, everyone. Very, very great debate, and we wish everyone a terrific, continued terrific day. Thank you.